the richest houses in Westeros is actually a more complex and more interesting topic than I first thought it would be when I began to work on this video. There are two key reasons for this. While George R. R. Martin's world building is in-depth and expansive, it does still have its blind spots and areas where things are a bit vague, still fleshed out enough that the world and the story function without a second thought. The economy of Westeros is one of these more vague areas. The other issue is the mindset of each reader's interpretation of what rich or wealthy means. There's this huge misconception that houses outside the likes of the great houses, such as the Lannisters and Tyrells, are not wealthy. When you think about the setting, even the most minor of minor houses are much wealthier than your average person living in Westeros. It's just these great houses are so ridiculously rich in comparison. For example, think of all the smaller houses who own Valyrian steel weapons. Those weapons alone and the value they hold make the houses extremely wealthy. The way to try and look at it is we are kind of comparing millionaires to billionaires, with there even being some trillionaires, such as House Lannister. I think something that has compounded this issue is the way the HBO shows, in particular House of the Dragon, has portrayed members of these smaller houses. A popular cited example of this is Alinda Massey, and specifically her costume, which is one of Rhaenyra's ladies-in-waiting. The way the show has dressed the ladies-in-waiting in general are akin to kind of scepters, or very bland and basic costumes, when in reality these women were high-born ladies and would have been dressed as such. We see this in the main book series and even on screen in Game of Thrones. House Massey is an ancient house and certainly not poor, even if Alinda was a lower member of the house, being a lady-in-waiting to a princess and later a claimant to the Iron Throne and a queen to some, she would still be treated as a high-born lady and dressed accordingly. It's compounded this view from some areas of the fanbase that small houses are poor, when it's far from reality. In this video, we're going to take a look at the wealthiest houses in Westeros and where their wealth comes from. While the obvious picks will be discussed, there will be a lot of surprises and maybe some houses you didn't think were as wealthy as they actually are. A Lannister always pays his debts. Tyrion Lannister to Bronn. A Game of Thrones Chapter 42. Tyrion 6. This video is in no particular order, so I think the best way to start would be with the most obvious rich houses. House Lannister, a house so rich they were basically able to bankroll almost all of Robert Baratheon's time as king. Their unofficial motto is a Lannister always pays his debts, and that's become synonymous with them for a reason. As to just how rich the Lannisters are, it's actually hard to say. George R. R. Martin has never been great when it comes to numbers, and is very inconsistent. For example, in the Dunk and Egg novellas, Dunk suggests that a common-born, skilled workman might see 3 gold dragons a year, which suggests a gold dragon is a lot of money. Then we have Anguy, who won 10,000 gold dragons for the archery competition at the Hand's Tourney, and he manages to spend it in just a few weeks on 3 expensive working girls, a roast swan, arbor wine, a fine dagger, and a pair of boots. So that 10,000 didn't actually go very far. Then we have the 300 gold dragons offered by Brienne's father for her ransom. If we didn't have Jaime's remark that that's an acceptable ransom for a knight, we would have every reason to believe that Brienne's father didn't really care about her at all. But Jaime implies here that 300 gold dragons is quite a lot. So the value of a dragon really is not consistent. I've seen some people estimate, using real-world numbers as a comparison, that a single gold dragon is worth $17,000. If that were the case, Anguy would have won $170 million at the Hand's Tourney. The winner of the Joust of the Hand's Tourney would have won nearly $500 million. So, thanks to the inconsistent value of gold in Westeros, and no real way of actually gauging the value of a gold dragon, it's hard to really quantify the wealth of House Lannister, and we really rely on contextual clues. I've seen several different sources, from Reddit posts to Financial Times articles, suggesting that House Lannister could be worth as little as a few $1 billion to close to near $1 trillion. But for the context of this video, we are going to use House Lannister as a benchmark to compare to. Now, Technically, House Lannister stole their wealth. Initially they did, when Lan the Clever stole Casterly Rock from the last Casterly. With that, he also presumably stole all the wealth of House Casterly. And of course, on top of that, House Lannister have been in power now thousands of years, with the rock itself the richest gold and silver mine in all of Westeros, and maybe even the known world, providing income for them. For a bit of perspective, the gold mines of Casterly Rock are famed as far as Ashai by the Shadow in the far east of Essos. While in the HBO show it's alluded to that the gold mines at Casterly Rock had run dry centuries ago, it does not appear that's the case in the books, with George R. R. Martin in a blog post very much indicating gold is still actively being mined from the rock. So when you think about it for a second, these gold mines are so large and expansive, they've literally been continuously mined since the Age of Heroes, and are still being mined during the main books. Hence why House Lannister are effectively unimaginably rich. But it's not just wealth in gold that makes House Lannister rich, but the way they've used their gold. For example, as we learn in A Game of Thrones, the crown personally owes Tywin Lannister 3 million gold dragons. The value of the gold itself doesn't really seem to bother Tywin. We know from how he handled the Rain Tarback revolt that if he wanted the gold back, he would find one way or another to do so, especially after Joffrey and Tommen become king. He's hardly going to be knocking on the Red Keep's gate with a collection notice. The debt the crown owes Tywin gives him leverage, and with that leverage comes much more power and influence than he already had. As we know from the real world, you are certainly unfathomably rich when you are using your endless wealth to influence politics and buy power and position. So while we cannot give a clear number of how rich House Lannister are, we can from contextual clues get a ballpark idea. We also must recall that the wealth of the Lannisters does not just come from the gold of Casterly Rock, but their control of one of the 5 cities in Westeros, Lannisport, and the taxes imposed on shipping in and out of the port, as well as the fact that their bannermen, some of whom control their own lesser gold mines, also pay taxes to House Lannister. The Tyrells were only stewards the Dragon King had up-jumped far above their station. Their vanity was exceeded only by their ambition. The Thoughts of Cersei Lannister, A Feast for Crows Chapter 3. Cersei 1. Now, there's actually quite a bit of debate as to who the second richest house in Westeros is. It does seem like it's a toss-up between House Tyrell and a surprise inclusion for some of House Hightower. Again, it's very difficult to figure out who is the richer house with numbers, so we have to again use contextual clues, and even then that's very much open to interpretation. It is indicated that House Tyrell is the second richest of the great houses after House Lannister, but again we can't really say by how much. From how House Tyrell is talked about in text, it's not enough to cause men like Tywin Lannister concern about losing House Lannister's position, but rich enough to overshadow the other great houses and make a real impact when it comes to the War of the Five Kings. For example, the same way House Lannister were bankrolling the crown, House Tyrell were well prepared to do the same with Renly Baratheon during the War of Five Kings before his death. The key fundamental difference between the wealth of House Lannister and that of House Tyrell is where it comes from. The Lannister wealth comes from their gold mines, the Tyrells from farming and agriculture. They control the Reach, which is of course the breadbasket of Westeros. A little bit of perspective is they were the stewards to the former kings of the Reach of House Gardener prior to Aegon's conquest, where they were then raised up as Lords of the Reach by Aegon. Now, they may have inherited whatever wealth House Gardener had, but if not, they would have likely have accumulated their wealth in less than 300 years, which is impressive compared to the thousands of years of head start House Lannister had. But in all probability, the same way Lannister wealth is tied to gold, the Tyrell wealth is tied to food, and food prices drastically fluctuate, which in turn makes establishing the wealth of House Tyrell difficult. One thing that will certainly drive up the cost of food is a huge war spanning the whole of Westeros. Therefore, I've seen some argue that because of the current state of affairs in Westeros, and thus the high price of food, House Tyrell might in theory currently be wealthier than House Lannister, albeit if it's only for a brief moment. The Hightowers are an ancient family, very rich and very proud. Jorah Mormont to Daenerys Targaryen. A Clash of Kings Chapter 12. Daenerys 1. So, what about House Hightower? Could they really be the second wealthiest house in Westeros? Richer than even the overlords of House Tyrell? Surprisingly, yes. So before we get into just how rich House Hightower actually are, let's try and understand their history, and thus why they came into such wealth. House Hightower is a very old house, likely coming from the earliest of the first men to come to Westeros. There is even some suggestion they could predate the first men entirely. If you go further down that rabbit hole, there are some theories, of which I've made videos on, that suggest they could have some kind of Velaryon descent, with Old Town being an old Velaryon trading post. However old House Hightower really is, doesn't really matter. They're just really old. The key to their wealth is really the city of Old Town and its strategic position on the mouth of the Redwyne River. Old Town is by far the largest city in size and population in Westeros, as well as being arguably the most economically important. If you want to trade goods from Essos, the Free Cities, or the likes of King's Landing or White Harbour, with the western coast of Westeros, you will more than likely be stopping at Old Town on the way, where House Hightower will of course place levies and taxes for that privilege of trading there. Trade can then also pass up the river to the interior of the Reach, with goods like the Tyrell food then passing through Old Town on the way back down. But Old Town isn't just an economic powerhouse, it's also the location of the Citadel, and thus the home of the Maesters, and also contains the Starry Sept, which while no longer the home of the faith in Westeros since the construction of the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing, is still an important religious site where many Septons and Septors live and train. And of course, members of House Hightower are embedded in both of those institutions, and those institutions hold great power across Westeros, embedded within its very fabric. So, much like House Lannister, they've had thousands of years to accumulate their wealth, and their source of wealth is relatively stable. While we don't have any figures, there is a lot to suggest House Hightower is in fact richer than the overlords, House Tyrell, which is extremely odd. But this is in part due to the fact House Tyrell's position of power is historically very recent, and thus the Hightowers have had a huge head start on them. Some people rightly point out it was a bizarre decision by Aegon the Conqueror to make House Tyrell lords paramount of the Reach over the Hightowers, given the house's history, power and wealth. And this is going to be a topic of another video coming soon. It's a very complicated discussion. There's even some suggestion in the books that House Hightower could even be as rich as the Lannisters. In A Feast for Crows, Sam 5, we are told they are in fact as rich as the Lannisters, and can field 3 times as many swords as any of the other Tyrell bannermen, as well as the manpower of Old Town itself, and their massive, impressive fleet of ships. Now, the idea of them being as rich as the Lannisters may or may not be true. It's hard to say without numbers. But what we can say is this. After the downfall of House Rogaire and the collapse of the Rogaire Bank in the Lycian spring of 136 AC, during the regency of King Aegon III, Lotho Rogaire was taken into the service of Lady Samantha Tarly, the paramour and stepmother of Lord Lionel Hightower. House Hightower had not entrusted any of its gold to the Rogaire Bank prior to its collapse, and thus remain one of the wealthiest houses in Westeros in the wake of the Dance of the Dragons. Lady Samantha wished to learn how to better invest and founded the Bank of Old Town, which has made House Hightower even richer. Now, we don't hear mention of the bank by the time in the main books, but this might be due to the fact we first learn of the bank during the back end of Fire and Blood, which was written after all the published main books. So the idea of the Bank of Old Town is quite recent in the world building. But the main point here is the amount of money you would need. We're talking hard cash to set up and operate your own bank is eye-watering, and speaks to just how rich House Hightower are. They had the available free cash to be able to do this without impacting the house's day-to-day function. They are arguably richer than House Tyrell, and maybe even rivaling that of the Lannisters if the claims in the main books are to be believed. The 3 houses we've talked about so far, the Lannisters, the Tyrells and the Hightowers, are the ultra-rich houses, your trillionaires if you like. The houses I want to talk about now are some of the houses that are still very rich, maybe even richer than some of the great houses, but houses you might not initially think of as being wealthy if you don't look past those 8 great houses. Now again, it's important to remember we don't really have any numbers to play with, but we do have some contextual clues from the text that give a lot away. The Redwyne sigil for the Arbor. There is no finer drink. A wine cellar to Daenerys Targaryen. A Game of Thrones Chapter 54. Daenerys 6. House Redwyne appears to be a very rich house. The Arbor is renowned all over Westeros and even into the far east of Essos for its vineyards, specifically the vintage of wine known as Arbor Gold, a white wine, fruity and rich, and is a favourite of lords and rich merchants alike. For example, it's known many members of House Targaryen drank Arbor Gold, and it's the favoured wine of Cersei Lannister. It's not your average wine. Of course, the Redwynes also make other wines, some much more affordable to your average person, so much of their wealth will come from these wines. A real marker of just how rich House Redwyne actually are is the fact they can build and maintain their own fleet of ships, which is an extremely costly affair. By the time in the main books, the Redwyne Navy is the largest fleet in Westeros, containing 200 warships and 5 times as many merchant carracks, wine cogs, trading galleys and whalers. Thus, during the War of the Five Kings and its aftermath, they are courted by almost every side. In fact, the sons of Lord Paxter are held as hostages in King's Landing to prevent the House Redwyne siding with Renly Baratheon. When House Tyrell joins with the Lannisters after Renly's death, so does House Redwyne, and thus the Redwyne fleet makes up a bulk of the royal fleet. The island of the Arbor itself is also perfectly placed to either influence or control shipping between the west coast and the east coast of Westeros, much like Old Town. In addition, the island actually lies close to Old Town, and thus the Honeywine River, so all the trade that would head to Old Town also goes via the Arbor as well. According to the World of Ice and Fire, several small islands around the Arbor and many settlements on the main island give way to a large amount of economic activity. Politically, they are also a very important house. So important, Olenna Redwyne, later Olenna Tyrell, the mother of the current Lord of Highgarden Mace Tyrell, was once engaged to a Targaryen prince, and her position as the matron of House Tyrell, given their current standing with Marjorie as queen, in turn will bolster the influence of House Redwyne even more. The Freys of the Crossing were no nobler than the Butterwells. They owned a bridge instead of cows. That was the only difference. The thoughts of Sir Duncan the Tall, a knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the Mystery Knight. House Frey is likely one of the richest houses in the Riverlands, but the issue is, because of their poor reputation and general aesthetic, the fact they are very rich is often widely forgotten. It's quite obvious where the Frey's money has come from, the seat of the twins itself. House Frey dates back at least 600 years, making it one of the more younger noble houses in the Seven Kingdoms, with some in House Frey believing this is why the other houses of the Riverlands look down on them. The first Lord Frey was awarded lands and a noble status, and began construction of a great bridge spanning the Green Fork of the Trident. Construction was finished under the rule of his grandson, who added wooden keeps on both sides of the river. The timber keeps were eventually replaced by stone, which received the name the Twins. Due to their strategic location, House Frey prospered by exacting tolls for passage across the river, greatly increasing their wealth. It is not that the Twins is the only crossing of the Green Fork, but it is the fastest and most convenient. Whether you're a lord going to war, or a small merchant looking to trade, all have to pay a toll to the Freys. While gold is often the most common toll the Lord of the Crossing enacts, they have been known to accept other things as payment. For example, as we see in the main books, the marriage pact with Robb Stark to allow him to cross the Twins with his army. So while House Frey is cash rich, their power also means they can act politically. Thus, House Frey has grown into one of the most powerful bannermen of House Tully of Riverrun. In fact, House Frey rules over wider domains and can call upon more soldiers than their own liege lords. Some speculate they could in fact be even richer than the Tullys. House Frey is currently even richer and more powerful than they were at the start of the main books, with Riverrun and its associated lands being granted to House Frey for their part in the Red Wedding towards the end of the War of the Five Kings. While House Frey of Riverrun is technically a cadet branch of the house and a separate entity, they still do fall under the Frey banner. I am an old man, but not so old I will sit here meekly, while the likes of you plot to steal her crown. Lyman Beesbury to the small council of Viserys I Targaryen. Fire and Blood, the Dying of the Dragons, the Blacks and the Greens. House Beesbury of Honeyholt might surprise a lot of people with being on this list, but they are a perfect example of a small house who might very well be quite wealthy. Don't get me wrong that they are one of the wealthiest houses in the realm, but given all the contextual clues we have, leads me to believe they could have quite a decent income. Firstly, their seat, Honeyholt, is located on the banks of the Redwyne River in the Reach, which flows between Old Town and Brightwater Keep. The World Book implies they produce many things made by bees: honey, beeswax, mead, all of which seem to be highly prized throughout Westeros. Honey for its sweetness, enjoyed by the richer of the lords. Mead is likely as popular of a drink as wine and ale, and beeswax might even be their most valuable export, given how vital candles are in the kind of setting Westeros is. You just have to look at our real-world history to see the importance of the beeswax trade. In addition, House Beesbury can easily transport their products to either Old Town via the Redwyne or other parts of the highly populated Reach via the likes of the Rose Road, and further afield using the Rosby Road and the King's Road. During the reigns of King Viserys I, and before that Jaehaerys I Targaryen, Lord Lyman Beesbury was the Master of Coin on the Small Council, a time when House Targaryen was probably at its peak. Lord Lyman being selected as a Master of Coin and being from a smaller house such as the Beesburys means he must have shown and proven to have enough knowledge of dealing with finances and acquiring wealth to be considered for the role. 1,000 years before the conquest, a promise was made and oaths were sworn in the Wolf's Den before the old gods and the new, when we were sore beset and friendless, hounded from our homes, in peril of our lives. The wolves took us in and nourished us, and protected us against our enemies. This city is built upon the land they gave us. In return, we swore that we should always be their men, Stark men. Wyler Manderly, to the Merman's Court. A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 19, Davos 3. House Manderly are certainly the wealthiest house in the north. Even before they were exiled from the Reach and forced to relocate thousands of years ago, House Manderly were already an extremely rich family, from controlling the castle of Dunstanbury along the Mander, and thus also all the trade that comes along it. When they were forced to relocate to the north, they were granted the small seat of the Wolf's Den on the White Knife River by House Stark. House Manderly over the following centuries would use the wealth they had brought with them from the Reach to build the city of White Harbour, the first and only true city in the north. It is the smallest of the 5 cities of Westeros and is the main northern port for commerce and naval transport. Until the construction of King's Landing during Aegon's conquest, White Harbour was also the newest of the cities in the Seven Kingdoms. The new castle was later built to replace the ageing Wolf's Den and resembled their previous castle of Dunstanbury in the Reach. Not only did the city grow large, but so did its port, and it's with its port that House Manderly grew even richer than they were before. What few goods the North produces they can sell rather than use themselves are traded via White Harbour, and thus any goods coming into the North would also come via the port rather than overland through the King's Road. It is likely one of the largest importers of food from the more fertile regions to the south. It also appears that White Harbour does a good trade in seafood. During the War of 5 Kings, Lord Wyman Manderly offers to create a royal mint for Robb Stark, arguing he would need his own coinage if the North was to become a true independent kingdom, something that would be costly for the Manderlys to establish. We also know having your own navy is a good marker of wealth, given the cost of building and maintaining it. Now, House Manderly has hundreds of longships they use for trading, but during the War of 5 Kings, Lord Wyman again offers to build Robb Stark a fleet of warships, given that the North had not had their own navy for centuries. This, of course, would have been, again, a very costly thing for House Manderly to embark on. Now, if you had not noticed, some of the richest houses in Westeros are houses that control ports, be that large cities or smaller towns. Thus, it would make sense that houses like House Riker of Duskendale, House Grafton of Goldtown, House Mooton of Maidenpool, and others like them were all wealthy due to the trade and thus the taxes from their ports. Obviously, not every port is made equal, but I would still place them among the richer houses of the realm. He was the scion of House Velaryon a family of old and storied Velaryon heritage who had come to Westeros before the Targaryens, as the histories agree, and who often provided the bulk of the royal fleet, the writings of Maester Yandel, the world of ice and fire, the Targaryen kings, Richest I. I want to end this video by talking briefly about House Velaryon, because what their story can show us is how this concept of a rich house is something that is always in flux and changing as generations pass. As the fortunes of houses rise and fall, House Velaryon is a very old and ancient house with links back to Old Valyria. They had always been a seafaring and trading family, with Driftmark becoming one of the most important ports in the Narrow Sea for trading goods specifically between Essos and Westeros. But for a very brief moment, House Velaryon were as rich, and if some tales are to be believed, richer than even House Lannister. This was all thanks to one man, Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, whom in his youth went on 9 famed voyages around the known world, bringing back with him rare goods of all sorts, jewels and expensive spices that were worth a fortune in Westeros. During his 9th and final voyage, Corlys filled his ship gold and brought 20 more ships when he reached Karth, loading his fleet with spices, elephants and silk. Only 14 of the ships returned to Driftmark, and all the elephants died. But Corlys Velaryon became vastly wealthy from this venture. He accumulated so much wealth, the House Velaryon became the richest house in the realm, and Corlys himself, the wealthiest man in the Seven Kingdoms. In theory, this kind of wealth should have lasted generations, but much of the riches of House Velaryon were lost as a direct result of their involvement in the Targaryen civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. While the house would stabilise, and in some way prosper under Corlys' ancestors, they would never reach that zenith again. By the time in the main books, they were a shadow of what they once were, and what they could have been. What I hope we learnt with this video is that even the smaller houses in Westeros are very rich and wealthy in comparison to your average person. You don't have to be one of the so-called great houses of the realm to have wealth, power and influence. And these aren't even all the houses that I could have mentioned in this video, but just some very good examples of these smaller houses. In the end, there are just some ridiculously rich houses that seem to overshadow the rest.